Good morning. We'd like to welcome everyone back this morning. Um, as we get started, we're going to ask Brother Dick if he would lead us in a word of prayer.
Our Holy Father, which art in heaven, we're grateful unto you for this opportunity to come together with our brothers and sisters in Christ on this Lord's Day, for the purpose of magnifying your name and worshiping you in spirit and in truth, and edifying one another. We pray your blessings on us as we engage in this study together. Help us to learn the benefit of history and learning about departures that have taken place in the past, so that we might not repeat those same mistakes again. Help us to have a respect for the authority of your word and to try to keep it pure and simple as you have made it. Help us to be willing to defend it against any encroachments. Father, we pray your blessings on us this week as we families gather together for a holiday. We pray that we'll always be mindful of things that you bless us with, and that our Thanksgiving won't be limited to just one time in the year. We'll remember that you're blessing us daily and hourly as well. Pray that you'll be with Scott and all the teachers as they impart into us the results of their study. Help us also to do our own study so that we might be able to teach your word and to defend it against all others who may challenge it. Help us to have a right attitude towards you and towards your word and toward each other. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
Amen.
Last week, we had gotten into the questions of the second lesson in the book, discussing the Missionary Society and the problems with that. And this is about where I believe we got to, question 7. It seemed like a good place to kind of start back. Before we move on, does anyone have any comments or questions from last week? Okay. Well, it says answer the following defenses of the Missionary Society. And of course, this is the reasons that supporters of the Missionary Society give to support their view. And they say it's an expedient way to preach, that Jesus and his disciples were the first missionary society. The society was necessary for smaller churches to be able to preach, that those opposing the missionary society are against doing missionary work, and that the missionary society is right because of the good that it's doing. So how would you answer the first one, that it's an expedient way to preach? Yes, Dick.
Well, first, I would argue whether or not it is expedient. I don't think they can prove that. For one thing, to me, the most expedient way is the way it was done in the Bible, where they sent directly to the preacher instead of sending to a society and letting them make the decisions. But secondly, there are a lot of things that have been defended on the basis of expediency that won't hold water, like baptism. Sprinkling for baptism has been defended on the basis that that's an expedient way to do it. The thing has to be lawful before it's first expedient.
Okay. And that was the answer, of course, that the book was looking for. And the one that I put down is that if it's not authorized, it can't be expedient. And we covered that before. The next one was that Jesus and his disciples were the first missionary society. How would you argue about that? Anybody? Church hadn't been established at that time, so it couldn't have been the first missionary society of churches. And there was someone else over here. Okay. So Jesus and his disciples were doing the work. They weren't delegating it to someone else. Yes, Mr. Williams.
It's interesting that J.B. Briney in 1906, said that. But back in the 1870s, and for quite a while, for the next 15 years, J.B. Briney was to instrumental music especially, not the society maybe, but he was opposed to so I'm getting, but at least it says something about this guy. He wrote some of the best critiques I've ever read against use of instrumental music in worship for a number of years, but by 1885, he had changed because he couldn't convince the mass of the brethren by sound scriptural reasoning that they were wrong and they were going to have the instrument. He decided to throw in the towel and just go with them and try to make some good sounding arguments for it, although he really knew that there was, but I'm really crossing this problem. Well, anyway, in Kentucky, most of the brethren there believed in the society, but they were opposed to instrumental music.
So they were sorting out their beliefs.
But they died out pretty soon.
Yep. Okay.
So pardon me for getting a little off the point. I just wanted to mention Briney, who made that statement.
Okay. The argument that I came up with was, as you pointed out, they were individuals sent by Jesus' authority to do the work. The church hadn't been established, and once it was established and it was given the task, then that task could not be given to someone else. So how would you argue about their statement that the society is necessary for smaller churches to be able to preach the gospel? Yes, sir.
I would like to say one thing about this matter of Judas Iscariot being the treasurer, of the group. This is a foretype, or that's not quite a foregleam of what the church is going to be in Acts 2 and those early chapters. They're also going to have a centralized treasury in the church.
Mm-hmm.
Some brethren have been very hard that the church shouldn't have a treasury. Well, the church began with a treasury, just as during the Lord's personal ministry, he and his disciples had a treasury or a treasurer, to handle the treasury.
Mm-hmm.
And the apostles first were handling it, but it was too much for them, and then they appointed other men, but they still kept the treasury.
Yes. Dick?
The church, large or small, is not responsible for any more than it's able to do. I've known some small churches that are more evangelistic than large ones were. But a small church can evangelize. This question makes it sound like if you're small, you can't evangelize.
Right.
But you can.
Well,
That's how they got started.
and the church certainly is supposed to evangelize, but so are members. And I think we pointed that out several times, that even if you're just one or two gathered together, you can still evangelize. And that was the point to be made against this argument. The next one was that those opposing the missionary society were against doing mission work. Well, that one is obviously wrong. I mean, that's what Jesus told us to go do. It's not the agency that we're against. It is the agency, the missionary society, that we're against, not the missionary work itself. And then the last argument was that the missionary society is right because of the good it was doing. An old argument, you can't do good by doing wrong. So, yeah.
Jesus said, "Depart from me, for I never knew you."
Yes, he did. Mm-hmm.
Not authorized in the Bible.
Okay. Yes, sir, Mr. Williams.
By 1869, the opposition was so strong to the missionary society, it almost, died. Now, the missionary society was to be an organization for the total brotherhood.
Mm-hmm.
And their thing is, they need to bring along these brethren, or at least even the opposition in some way. Finally, in 69, they had the Kentucky kind until 1875. And they weren't to talk about the society per se. They weren't to talk about presidents and vice presidents and all that kind of thing. And they developed an organization with district churches, state churches, and then the society, the National Convention Society, etc. And the district churches were to keep what they gathered for the local area, pass on a half to the state, organization, and then they were to pass on a half to the national organization. But what happened was, the national organization got almost nothing. In 1 year, the district churches got $48,000, but the national headquarters only got $2,600. They had trouble just paying their their corresponding secretary. They're not doing much good for sure.
No.
And in '73, I think, the state churches now, which is one step up from the district, they had gathered $86,000, and half of that should have gone on to the national organization, but they only got a little less than $8,000. So what that shows is that the local churches, even when they went along with the missionary society, they were mainly concerned with mission. If Brother Jim doesn't mind the word mission, preaching the gospel there in the locality rather than thinking about it somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
That's my whole problem with the thing to begin with. Where do we get off on this mission thing? Your work should be in your local community first. If you've got the funds and you want to support those abroad, fine. But it's just like, I think of the churches about 50 years ago, I think it was, in Alabama. They did a thing they called swarming. A congregation would get up to around between 125 and 150 people, they'd swarm. Some would branch off and go start a congregation, about 25 people start a congregation closer to where they live. They have a nucleus, and they evangelize a community until, that surrounding area, and they get up to 150 and then a branch of that. That's how the gospel was preached. And that's the thing. I don't find the word mission anywhere in the Bible. And I think this whole idea of, we gotta support missionaries, well, that's fine, but what are you doing in your local community first? To me, it's just self-aggrandizing, if you wanna know how I actually feel about it. A congregation says, we support 4 missionaries. Well and good. And how many people in your local community are going to hell every day because they've never heard the gospel? How are you gonna justify that on the day of judgment?
Well,
I particularly disagree, except this. Where do you find swarm in the New Testament?
Well, you don't, but that was a term that they used, but
Yeah,
that is how they use that term where they say they're gonna have a swarm, they branch off, but that's called evangelizing, and that's what we should be doing. Our emphasis should be on evangelism and not on missionary societies or missionary work.
yes, Dick.
I agree with the point that Jim is making, but I don't think our problem is with the word mission. When we use the old slogan of calling Bible things with Bible names, not every Bible thing has a name.
True.
And we're left to call it whatever when it doesn't give it a name. We use the phrase Great Commission. That's not found in the Bible either, but we all understand what that means. It's found there in Mark 16, 15, and 16, and Matthew 28. And there are other words, like you mentioned the word swarm. Those words aren't used, but the idea is there. And so with the word mission is somebody that's sent off for a purpose. Jesus had a mission coming to the earth. I don't know what else you could call it, since it's not called anything in particular. So we have to supply the words that describe what it was. But the idea that Jim is talking about, I believe is right.
Okay. Jonathan?
I was going to say that's an apiculture term. That's the behavior of bees.
Yes. That they tend to swarm and break off and establish new colonies. Yes, Mr. Williams.
Yes, I meant to add also a moment ago that by 1875, the Kentucky Plan was not working for, the national organization of the society. And so they were gonna jump that and go back to the way they were doing things, and had decided by this time, they're going to ignore completely the opposition. So that obviously now it's not going to be a brotherhood word, but they're already, having this practical division. We're ignoring completely the critics because we can never satisfy them. But when they got strong enough, they began to send out guys throughout all the churches, trying to force all the churches to become society churches and put pressure on other churches. Now, if doing that good and dividing churches and causing misery is good, well then go for it.
Okay. I'm going to make a couple of comments and then we're going to move on. So I'm going to have the last word. I agree with what has been said for the most part. However, or not however, let me just continue. If we support missionaries just to say that we have fulfilled our obligation, that's wrong. As Jim pointed out, we do have obligation to those around us. However, Jesus told his disciples when he sent them out, he said, if they won't receive you, shake off the dust of your feet and go on. And so if we're in a locality where they're not receiving us, we have every responsibility to move on to other people and not keep trying to beat a dead horse. So I'm going to leave it at that. Question 8. Explain the concept of the all-sufficiency of the church. And I think we've covered this enough. Basically, the church, as planned by God and built by Christ, is perfectly capable of doing every work that God told it to do. And so we don't need anything else. Question 9, what's wrong with an organization of churches doing a work? And I think we've answered that as well. It's not authorized. Any comments on those couple of questions?
Yes, and somebody has to oversee it.
Somebody has to oversee the work.
And that will take it outside the boundaries or the walls of the church.
Mm-hmm. And that brings us to this question. Who are the officers, and that's supposed to be of the universal church, and what are their qualifications?
There are no officers in the
Yes, there's only one. It was Christ. And he's qualified because it's his church. God put him there. And God gave him all the authority. And so he is the officer. He's the head. Okay? And what is the next one? What is the correct response when one learns that the scriptures are silent about a given practice? We better not perform it. We should stay silent about it as well. Okay? And then name some modern religious practices about which the scriptures are silent. Yes, Mr. Williams.
I just wanted to say about this matter of, what about when the scriptures are silent about something? When these brethren first started, they all meant that if we can't find it in the scriptures, no matter how much we love this practice, we're going to have to give it up.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the sons-in-law of Campbell, Pendleton, argued, no, that's not really what it meant. All it meant was we shouldn't be under creeds that the Bible is silent about. But another son-in-law in 1869 wrote 2 volumes on the life memoirs of Alexander Campbell, his father-in-law. And he pointed out from the very beginning what it's meant, and it shouldn't ever change no matter what some liberal brethren say. It means if it's not there, really not there. Like sometimes it's just a matter of words. For example, the word mission, I think it just means ascending. And a Latin word meaning sending. to do something, you know, and God sent Christ into the world, so, I mean, even if we don't, well, that's beside the point. All I'm gonna say is that if the New Testament is really silent about something, it means we're doing it, we gotta stop doing it.
I bet that Thanksgiving at the Alexander House was kind of awkward that year, wasn't it? So, back to this question, some modern religious practices about which the scriptures are silent, obviously missionary societies, but also church-supported schools, church-supported daycares, tithing, that's not in the New Testament, instrumental music, family life centers. And so all of those things, and there are probably lots more that people could name that churches support that we don't have the authority to do, and so we're not supposed to do them. Yes, sir.
And one more that, you know, that became a matter in the 1950s. There's nothing in the New Testament about one church being blown up to be a society, so to speak, or a governing body, or et cetera, functioning governing body for a number of local congregations.
Yes, that was just a wolf in sheep's clothing again. It was another reiteration of the missionary society. And so what effect did churches supporting the missionary societies have on the unity of the brethren? Excuse me? It divided them. Yes, it did. It led to disunity and splitting of the church. And that is wrong. And so if, you know, that's another case, if what you're doing leads to splitting of the church, you better question it. Yes, Dick?
I think it's important that we continue to remind ourselves that it wasn't instrumental music that caused that split. That came 10 years after the Missionary Society. It
Yes.
contributed to the split, but the initial thing that caused the split was the Missionary Society. 10 years, 1849, and then instrumental music in 1859.
Well, it's interesting that you mention that because that leads us to our next lesson. Let me get it pulled up here and going. Instrumental music and worship. Kind of an easy segue there, wasn't it? Before we do that, anyone have any other comments? I think the discussion is good, and I'm glad we have it. So, let me first ask, what is music? Can someone define that? Go ahead, Jonathan.
Had to do that for the young song leaders, but music is changes in pitch over changes in time.
Okay, that's one way. Anyone else? Organized noise, okay. That's a good one. Then is it noise? Okay. I believe that my parents would have said that about some of the music I listened to growing up. And certainly I say it about some of the music going on today, and I'm sure that generations have pointed the finger and said that's not music to the generations coming up. So that's, yeah, I agree. The definitions that I had, there were a couple, and there's more that I'm going to be getting to, but it's music is vocal or instrumental sounds combined in such a way to produce beauty of form, harmony, and the expression of emotion. And so that's kind of where I get to the question, if I call that noise, it gets to what our definition of noise is. I find noise to be irritating, whereas music is supposed to be soothing. So the other definition is that it's the written or printed signs that we use that we interpret to make the music, to make those sounds. And it's interesting that music is more than just entertainment. Every human society that we know about has used music. There's not a single one that they found that didn't have music in it. And so music is, to me, it's something that God put in us. I think that's where it comes from.
Yeah.
Yes, Jordan?
I just think it's so interesting because, you hardly come across any culture that doesn't have some sort of music, some sort of art. Those things are almost like a universal language.
Yes. Music, art, those are universal languages found in all cultures. And you could even make the argument that if a group doesn't have that, they're not a society or they're not a civilization. Because those are some of the things that are needed to make that, to make them that.
We're also, the one thing we're told that we're going to be doing in heaven is singing.
We are told we'll be singing in heaven.
So it makes sense for that to be a universal thing.
We know that the angels sing. So I think it's something that God has, that's fundamental in us. I don't know of anyone who doesn't like music. There's a particular genre of music that we may not appreciate, but there are forms that we do. So, fundamentally, music is a combination of sounds, and I think this gets to the definition Jordan gave a while ago. And sound is a vibration. And then Ferruccio, I don't know if I said that right, Busoni said music is sonorous air, and so basically it's vibrations in the air that sound good. And it's extraordinary to think that a simple vibration that we don't see, it can cause emotional responses in us. And that's powerful. And so I think that is one of the things, one of the reasons that God told us to sing. And I think it's one of the reasons that singing will be done in heaven. Okay. So any comments on our definition so far?
Yes, you mean more than that, in addition to soothing, it can also spur adrenaline.
It can.
That, music evokes every emotion, every feeling that is within us. Music is from God. Those notes that we sing are from God. That's why they harmonize with each other. If you think they don't, listen to the notes.
Of course.
It's used to teach, it's used to learn, it's used to persuade. It can just make us feel good. It also evokes memories. There's so many things about it. Sadness, yes.
But it can also be inspiring. I mean,
Yes.
you mentioned the things, and they played, the drums and fife to march people off to war.
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Williams.
I don't have any problem with what you're saying, except that the King James Version in the New Testament uses music only one time in the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15:25, where the elder brother heard music, but the Greek word there is symphony, which we get our word symphony, the harmony part of it. But the Greek word musikos, never occurs even one time in the New Testament. So God's not concerned with this general matter of music. He's only concerned with one expression, how he wants us to use our lips and our hearts in his service.
Yes. And so that brings us to instrumental music. So is it authorized in the worship of the New Testament church? And if I were a Greek scholar and couldn't find it anywhere there, I would have to say, no, it's not. Not being a Greek scholar, I have to do some other things, so. Sorry. Yes, Mr. Williams.
To start with, almost none of these brethren argue this way from, psalmos or psallo at all. They just, because they knew. As Pendleton said, another son-in-law of Campbell, in defending instrumental music in a manner, he he said, nobody can argue that instrumental music is mentioned in the New Testament anywhere. Well, that's the way, so they went the expediency method. It was only later, when expediency gets knocked down, that people, well, like Briney, grab for other things and try to prove instrumental music in some other way.
Yes.
I mean, from the Greek, when in fact, all these Bible scholars never translated it that way.
Okay. Well, as we learned in the lesson we just finished, it basically fell down to how you felt about authority. In the Christian church, or the disciples of Christ, had their view, and then the churches of Christ had the other. Now, the first reference presently available introducing instrumental music in worship, and we're talking about churches of Christ, or people who followed this restored church following, occurred in about 1849. There were a few in the 1850s, but in 1859 at the Midway Church is kind of where everyone points and says, yeah, that's where it really took off. Now, Alexander Campbell, and as we've discussed already, he's good on some things and he's not so good on some others, but on this one he said, I presume to all spiritually minded Christians, such aids would be as a cowbell in a concert. And so, you know, he's saying it has no place. It's not supposed to be there. Yes, Dick?
I would disagree with him when he calls it an aid. He used the word aid there. It's an addition, not just an aid. The New Testament never, not once, commands us to make music. It commands us to sing. Singing qualifies under music, but it doesn't encompass all music. There are two kinds. There's vocal and there's instrumental. Sometimes it is said that we don't believe in music, just like we don't believe in preaching the gospel if we're opposed to missionary stuff. We believe in music just as much as anybody does. But music alone is not the command. The command is to sing. That's a particular kind of music. And that's the only kind offered us. And when God wanted instruments in the Old Testament, he knew how to say it. He said gobs of times in the Old Testament, but when it comes to new, he's totally silent on that.
Yes.
May I
Sure.
add one thing, that I hope it's not in a negative sense against what Brother Blackford has said, but we have got to make, and we overlook this quite a lot, we need to make the distinction between mechanical instruments of worship and the instrument that God has given us with which to worship.
Yes, he specified what instrument.
Yes, and at the Hardeman-Boswell debate, which I read a few times, but that's Brother Hardeman essentially said at one point, sort of touched on this, okay, we have an instrument that we are supposed to use. It's the harp. That is our instrument. And I think that's right. I think it doesn't do the scriptures harm to say that the instrument that we're commanded to use is the harp, not a mechanical instrument. So we need to make that distinction as we have this discussion.
And making that distinction, then we have very specific authority that we have to recognize. And the specific authority excludes anything else. Yes, Mr. Williams.
I don't know that Alexander Campbell is, really just saying that instrumental music might be, is an aid in any meaningful sense. He's speaking very ironically there. He says that some people's spiritual level for worship is so low and so carnal that they may need some kind of aid to stir them up where they could get, of course, even then they wouldn't be yet where they ought to be, because it's just their carnal nature all stirred up. And when your carnal nature is all stirred up, how does that make it any better, easier for you to worship God? So I think Campbell is just speaking very ironically and contemptuously of the whole idea of any value for instrumental music for Christian worship.
Well, Benjamin Franklin, and we're not talking about one of the founders of the country, we're talking about one who came, 100 years later. And I don't know anything about him, so I'll just say that up front, but he apparently was somebody influential back then. He said it would only be permissible if they were trying to become a fashionable society and not a church. So he recognized that if you're bringing instrumental music in, then you're no longer the church. You're changing it into something else. So, well, there's a picture of the offending instrument right there. The addition of the melodeon. Most people will tell you that it was a piano. It wasn't. It was a melodeon, which is basically a shortened piano. Excuse me? It is short. It has, I don't remember the exact number, but instead of 88 keys, I think it has 60-something whenever. Yes, sir.
Now, what happened here was an elder opposed to the melodeon. He sent his, does it say it in the lesson?
Yeah,
here?
we're going to get
Okay.
to that.
Was it that size? The windows don't look very big to me. How did they get that? It must have been very small to get it out of the window.
Well, I think in the picture that it is there, it's inside a glass case. And so it's the smaller outline inside that picture that you see.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's sitting on a wooden plinth and a glass case built around it. So,
Oh, okay.
okay. Well, anyway, when they brought it in, it caused a lot of controversy. And again, we had the two groups saying, one that said we're okay with it, the other said we're opposed to it. But nevertheless, they brought it in and caused a lot of problems. Now, what they said originally caused the problem was that they had bad singing. And in fact, Pinkerton, who was the preacher at that place, he said it was so bad that it would scare the rats from worship. So, I've heard bad singing, Jordan.
Then why would you want a piano if you already get rid of the rat problem?
Well, it's a good question. Why do we want the rats? So, yes, sir.
Yes. I think he used two words. One was screeching and one was something else. But that's a case of where you want to introduce something. You want the present situation to be seen in the worst terms. I'm not sure it was that bad. I've heard some pretty bad singing in my days. I've often been in small churches. But screeching and this other word, he just wants the vocal aspect to be treated. Of course, what they did was they got the melodeon just to help them practice their singing, and so. But of course, I'm not sure Pinkerton was just going to be in his own mind yet, because he says, I'm the only preacher who publicly, has gone in favor of using an instrument. And to get the brethren that way, he had to take them, I'm sure, steps by steps. But I think he is over criticizing their singing for advantage.
Yes, Dick.
A long time, that melodeon was on display at the library there. It's now in the back room. But for a long time, out there in that glass case, which makes it look like a monument to division. Why preserve that and put a glass case around it and put it on display at a public place, unless they look at it as a monument to division?
Well, they were proud of it.
Yeah.
And we're going to cover that a little bit later on. Yes, Jonathan.
So he was on the side of wanting the music. Makes what he says seem a little less credible, kind of like asking a barber if you need a haircut.
Yeah, I agree. We're going to delve into it a little bit more. At first, some of the members met at the home of a brother to practice, which sounds good. We should do that. We should try to improve our singing. And, at first, they were just getting the pitch with it. And there's nothing wrong with using that to get a pitch.
Expensive.
It is an expensive pitch pipe. But before long, one of them started playing along with it. And that's when the addition of the instrument came into it. And they said, boy, this really sounds good. We need to keep doing this. And so they asked Pinkerton what he thought about bringing it into society. And his response was, I don't see any problem with it. And so they brought it in the next Sunday. Now, let me just kind of stop there. What was the problem? They went to Pinkerton for authority, didn't they? So that was the problem. Pinkerton was not the authority. They were put him in a position that he did not belong. So, okay.
Scott, this is probably insignificant, but we're talking about small congregations, rural for the most part, in the 1850s, 1860s. During those times, if you could find a publishing company that could publish 100 hymnals at the same setting, that was quite a feat in those days. And so often, the hymnals that you received had no music. They were just poetry, which is where we get the term verses. Today, there's no such thing in this songbook that we have. They're stanzas. Regardless of that, there was no music to so many of these hymnals that folks could get their hands on. And they may have, you may have 15 of these non-music hymnals in a congregation of 50 people, and no one had a clue about the tune that they were supposed to sing.
And I know that,
You had to choose a tune that fit the meter of the poetry.
yes, and that oftentimes the style of the music was different from what we do today. The leader might lead the first phrase himself and then do it again with everyone else following along. Yes, Mr. Williams.
Yes, the song leader, I mean, if they had a song leader, sometimes it might just be a person sitting in the front pew. But if they had a song leader, they called it lining it out. He would give them he would just tell them the first line and what tune they were going to use, because sometimes some of these hymns were sung to various tunes.
Yes.
You know, he would tell them, you know, and so then they would sing that line, and he'd give them a second line, and they would sing that one.
A good example is the old music to what we know as Amazing Grace, 8/6, 8/6 meter, and you could take any song in that music-less hymnal and do the 8/6, 8/6 meter and sing it to that same tune. You just had to announce to the congregation which tune you were using, and then sing the poetry. It was very different from what we've got today.
Yes. Well, as you, excuse me? Okay, well, as you might imagine, when they brought it into the church, it didn't go that smooth. And some people called it instruments of Satan. And you know, that's a pretty derogatory statement to make, you know, when you know, if I were to bring something in here and you called it an instrument of Satan, boy, that would be offensive to me. So you can imagine that it was offensive. And it was one of the elders, Adam Hibbler, who was most strongly opposed to it. And so late one night, he and his slave went to the building. Reuben went in, passed it out to Hibbler, and they put it on his wagon and took it back to his barn. So basically they just got rid of it. Nice way to deal with it. It wasn't his. But we'll stop here and we'll pick up next time. This is fun stuff. So.